Imagine an empire so vast that it spanned 3 continents, Europe, Asia Minor, and North Africa. An empire with millions of inhabitants from all races, ethnicities, and cultures. Rome, a city that started as a small village, became a melting pot of civilizations, where the customs of the most diverse peoples mixed. But how did the Romans view the different races and ethnicities that were part of their empire? How did they categorize the peoples of the conquered territories, from the noble Greeks to the barbarians of the north? Today, we are going to explore the Roman view of race and ethnicity and how the Romans saw the peoples that formed their vast empire. In their time, the concept of race was not based on skin color, but on something much more complex: culture, language, customs, and, of course, Romanization. Join me as we uncover how the Romans classified and perceived the peoples of the known world and how, in many cases, their prejudices mixed with their fascination for the exotic. In the Roman world, the concept of race did not exist as we understand it today. For the Romans, distinction was not based on skin color, but on geographic origin, language, customs, and behavior. Instead of thinking of people based on their physical appearance, the Romans classified peoples according to their culture and their degree of Romanization, that is, their ability to adopt the customs and laws of Rome. Imagine that a common Roman asks you about your race. What they would really want to know wouldn't be the color of your skin, but which people you belong to. Are you Greek, Carthaginian, Germanic, Egyptian, or perhaps Hispano? Each of these races, or rather, ethnic groups, came with a set of stereotypes that the Romans used to define the culture and abilities of those people. For example, the Greeks were highly respected in Rome for their philosophy, art, and science, but they were also considered somewhat effeminate or too intellectual. The Carthaginians, although intelligent, were seen as crafty and manipulative. The Germans, for their part, were admired for their physical strength, but the Romans considered them less civilized, more prone to violence and disorder. This classification was not based solely on negative prejudices. Every people had qualities that the Romans recognized and, in some cases, respected. However, cultural differences and the Roman belief that, being Roman, was the ideal form of civilization strongly influenced how they were perceived. The stereotypes about foreign peoples were not limited to general perceptions of Roman culture. Prominent figures such as Julius Caesar and Tacitus, 2 of the most influential Roman historians and generals, often described conquered peoples in ways that reflected both admiration and contempt. For example, Caesar described the Gauls as a superstitious, independent people, but also lazy and prone to violence. For Caesar, the Gauls were brave in battle, but their lack of organization and their tendency toward mystical beliefs made them inferior, or at least less civilized, than the Romans. On the other hand, historian Tacitus had a more complex view of the Germans, a people he admired for their strength and physical resilience. In his writings, Tacitus highlighted the nobility of the Germans regarding their simple life and discipline in battle. However, he also described them as too violent and with little sense of civilization. In his view, their enormous physical strength only served for the initial charge in battle, but they lacked the sophistication that Rome valued. Descriptions of distant peoples like the Ethiopians or Egyptians were even more extravagant. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder spoke of the strange customs of African peoples, describing tribes with physical characteristics and behaviors that today seem more mythological than historical. From peoples who supposedly had no noses to those who lived underground in caves, Pliny's descriptions were filled with awe and fascination, but also palpable discomfort with the unknown. Through these accounts, the Romans demonstrated how cultural differences and ignorance of other peoples could fuel both admiration and xenophobia. However, these descriptions were not limited to barbarian peoples. Even the more civilized peoples, like the Greeks, were not spared from criticism. Despite cultural differences, Rome was incredibly pragmatic when it came to integrating conquered peoples. If a people adopted Roman customs, language, and laws, they could be considered part of the Roman world, regardless of their ethnic or racial origin. This process of cultural assimilation was key to the expansion and stability of the empire, and it is what the Romans called Romanization. Being Romanized did not just mean adopting the Latin language, but also embracing Roman values of citizenship, social organization, and politics. Rome allowed conquered peoples to retain many of their local customs, but urged them to follow its legal system, build cities with Roman architecture, and adopt the Roman pantheon of gods, as well as integrate into its army and institutions. For example, Roman citizens in the provinces not only benefited from the protection of the empire, but they could also obtain certain political rights. In the provinces of Hispania and Gaul, many people managed to obtain the status of Roman citizens, which allowed them to participate in Roman politics and access the benefits of the system. This process of Romanization helped unify the empire, despite its incredible ethnic diversity. The Romans understood that cultural integration was essential to maintain control and foster stability. However, adopting these customs was not always easy. Often, there was a blending of local cultures with Roman ones, resulting in an interesting fusion of traditions. Thus, the Romanization of the peoples of the empire was not just a matter of accepting a new set of norms, but also of actively participating in the life of Rome. Those who did so could be part of the Roman world, regardless of their ethnic origins. Although Rome was an incredibly diverse and flexible empire in cultural terms, xenophobia was not absent. Like in any imperial society, tensions between Romans and foreign peoples could be evident, especially during times of change or mass migration. As the empire grew, and particularly during the Great Migration of the Germanic peoples, there was increasing animosity towards the barbarian peoples arriving at the borders of Rome. A clear example of these tensions is the reaction of the Romans to the Goths, who began settling within the empire during the 5th century AD. Many Romans saw the Goths and other Germanic peoples as invaders, and the xenophobia they felt toward them was even reflected in the laws. The Theodosian Code, a set of imperial laws, prohibited the wearing of pants, a symbol associated with the Goths, as well as other aspects of their clothing, creating a clear distinction between civilized and barbarian. These tensions reached a critical point when, in the 5th century, the Goths, under the leadership of Alaric, sacked Rome. The Romans, fearful and embarrassed, formed lynch mobs to attack the Goths within their own ranks, showing how even the peoples who were part of the empire could be viewed with distrust and hatred, simply because of their ethnic origins. However, this xenophobia was not an exclusive feature of the Romans. Despite the laws discriminating against foreign peoples and the growing animosity towards the Goths, Rome remained a place where, ultimately, what mattered most was behavior and the willingness to Romanize. If one spoke Latin or Greek, adopted Roman customs, and respected the laws of Rome, one could be accepted, no matter where they came from. In fact, the Romans had an interesting contradiction. While at times they vehemently rejected foreign peoples, they also showed remarkable cultural flexibility toward those willing to adopt their ways of life. This paradox reflects how Rome's view of races and ethnicities was, in many ways, more complex than simple rejection or acceptance. Throughout the history of the Roman Empire, we can see a fascinating mix of openness and exclusivity. The Romans, with their vast empire and incredible diversity, created a system where culture and behavior mattered most. Being Roman did not depend on your skin color or origin, but on your ability to adopt the language, customs, and laws of Rome. Despite their prejudices and xenophobic tensions, Rome allowed for an astonishing fusion of cultures that contributed to the greatness of the empire. However, we must also remember that Rome was not without contradictions. While celebrating cultural inclusion, it often fell into rejecting those who did not conform to its ideal of civilization. This tension between openness and exclusion shows us that, although the Romans accepted peoples from different origins, it was not always easy for them to accept diversity unreservedly. Ultimately, what we can learn from ancient Rome is that ideas about race, ethnicity, and civilization are always more complex than they appear at first glance. Throughout history, as in Rome, the definitions of us and them have been shaped by a range of factors, from cultural differences to power strategies. Now I ask you, what do you think? Do you believe Rome was an example of tolerance, or simply an empire that used its diversity to strengthen its power? Let us know your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to continue discovering more about the fascinating history of the Roman Empire.